So, hello everybody. I'm glad to see you.
Zdravo svima, drago mi je da vas vidim.
I want to welcome you. I think it should be in front of National Association for Transactional Analysis of Serbia and
Želim vam dobrodošlicu ispred Nacionalne asocijacije za transakcionalnu analizu Srbije, odnosno NATO-a.
And Serbian Union of Associations for Psychotherapy, Savez društva psihoterapeuta Srbije, which co-organizes this pre-conference workshop, because in just few days we are going to have our 11th National Psychotherapy Conference.
Koji je učestvovao zapravo u koorganizaciji ovog događaja kao prekongresne aktivnosti, zato što ćemo početi uskoro sa 11. kongresom psihoterapeuta Srbije.
And I want to welcome our lecturer, Ravi Welch. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Poželjela bih dobrodošlicu i našem predavaču Raviju Welchu. Hvala ti što si pristao da držiš ovo predavanje.
And thank you because it's free.
I hvala zato što je besplatno.
And of course, I want to thank you and welcome all of you. I think, if I'm not wrong, there are people from 26, maybe 27 or 8 countries here.
Također želim da poželim svima dobrodošlicu. Čini mi se da vas ima iz 26, 7, 8 zemalja.
Ima jako puno ljudi iz sveta transakcione analize.
Hoćeš ti engleski da
nastaviš? There's a lot of people from transactional analysis world, but also a lot of people who are psychiatrists, psychiatric social workers, special pedagogues, nurses, etc., who are working with people who have diagnosed with psychosis.
Pored ljudi iz sveta transakcione analize ima još psihijatara, specijalnih pedagoga, socijalnih radnika i tako dalje, dakle koji u zdravstvenoj zaštiti rade sa psihotičnim pacijentima.
So, I'm not going to waste any more time. So, Ravi, can you take over? Yes, and we will have a short break of 5 minutes at around 6:30.
Imaćemo kratku pauzu od 5 minuta, oko 6:30.
After that, we are going to answer to some of the questions, because there are so many of you probably to just some of questions.
Nakon toga ćemo odgovoriti na neka pitanja, naravno samo na neka, zato što vas je mnogo, pa naravno nećemo uspjeti na sva.
And I kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted or off, because if you don't do that, it's going to be noisy.
Najljubaznije vas molim da držite svoje mikrofone isključene, zato što će biti bučno i otežavat će rad.
And one more thing, we are going to put the link for a very, very brief survey in the chat room. So please take your time, and after we finish or after the break, please just do the survey. And it's especially important if you need the credits for continuing education. That's mainly for people from Serbia and region. Please put your license number in and along with your name and the email address.
Također ćemo staviti vrlo kratku anketu za koju vas molimo da popunite, svega nekoliko pitanja, naročito se odnosi na one ljude iz zemlje i regiona kojima će biti potrebno za takozvani KME, pa da upišu i svoju licencu kako bi mogli da ostvare to pravo.
Okay, so Ravi, please take over, and we will be watching and hearing you very closely.
Okay. Ravi, molimo te da preuzmeš i mi ćemo te slušati pažljivo.
Thank you very much. And you will also bundle the questions, and so people know that not all the questions.
I will watch the chat. I will watch the chat.
Okay. Sandra će nekako sakupiti pitanja, sažeti ih i na taj način ih postaviti. Neće biti moguće svako pojedinačno.
Good afternoon.
Dobar dan.
I'm very happy to be here.
Zaista sam srećan da sam ovde.
And I'm a little overwhelmed with the response.
Malo sam preplavljen ovim odzivom.
as I was asked to do this, we were thinking maybe 200 people would be here.
Kada sam pitan da ovo uradim, mislio sam da će biti oko 200 ljudi.
And it's a little, it makes quite an impression on me that there's so many people interested in the subject.
I zaista je ostavilo na mene jak utisak da je ovoliko ljudi zainteresovano za ovu temu.
My name is Ravi Welch.
Moje ime je Ravi Welch.
I'm a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist.
Ja sam klinički psiholog i psihoterapeut.
I've been involved with TA since 1972.
Uključen sam u TA još od 1972. godine.
I'm a second generation TA person.
Ja sam druga generacija TA terapeuta.
I grew up in India and I moved to the Confrontation Institute when I was 16 and a half years old.
Rođen sam i odrastao u Indiji, ali preselio sam se u Texas institut kada sam imao 16,5 godina.
And I lived in California and I worked in Confrontation Institute for 8 years.
Živeo sam u Kaliforniji i na Texas institutu nekih 8 godina.
While I did my studies at the University of California in Berkeley.
I svoje studije sam završio na Univerzitetu Berkeley.
During that time, I lived in the therapeutic community.
Za to vreme sam živeo u terapijskoj zajednici.
With 12 schizophrenics who were not on medication.
Sa 12 šizofrenih ljudi koji nisu bili medikalizovani.
And after that, I moved to Germany and I stopped working with schizophrenics.
Nakon toga sam se preselio u Nemačku i prestao da radim sa šizofrenim ljudima.
But in this introductory workshop, I would like to just talk about some of the work and the research that we did.
U ovoj uvodnoj radionici želim da podelim rad i generalno istraživanje na tu temu u kojem sam učestvovala.
I think we will have what's probably going to be more of a research based on our observations and how we worked with people who were not on medication.
Sve ovo će više biti zasnovano na našim observacijama, dakle u radu sa ljudima koji nisu bili pod lekovima.
And the language that I'm going to use is transaction analysis.
Jezik koji ću koristiti jeste jezik transakcione analize.
And I will talk about the very specific ways that I will be using it.
I upotrebljavat ću zapravo te termine na jedan vrlo specifičan način.
The Confrontation Institute was an institute that was put together by Jackie Schiff and some researchers.
Texas institut je bio osnovan zahvaljujući Jackie Schiff i još nekim istraživačima.
And there's quite a bit of misinformation out there about the institute.
I postoji dosta nekih pogrešnih informacija o samom institutu.
It's often confused with the project that Jackie Schiff had in her private family.
Često se meša sa projektom koji je Jackie Schiff započela u svom privatnom domu.
This was the professionalization of that.
Ovo je bila profesionalna organizacija.
And we were an institute with 20 patients altogether.
Bili smo na institutu sa 20 pacijenata ukupno.
We had 8 people on the staff.
8 ljudi kao osoblja.
The clientele was divided between inpatient and people who were already far enough along that they didn't need to be in the community.
Pacijenti su se delili na one koji su bili hospitalizovani, dakle, i one koji su bili dovoljno funkcionalni da to ne moraju da budu.
So 12 schizophrenics lived together.
Dakle, 12 šizofrenih pacijenata je živelo zajedno.
And the other 8 lived usually 2 or 3 in small communities with each other.
A ostalih 8, dakle, najčešće po 2-3 zajedno u zajednicama.
And I lived in the therapeutic community together with, to begin with, Jackie Schiff.
Ja sam živela u terapeutskoj zajednici, dakle, za početak sa Jackie Schiff.
And later with other members of the staff.
A kasnije sa ostatkom osoblja.
So that's a bit of a background to what we were doing.
To je mali background svega onoga što smo i radili.
I will focus for this workshop exclusively on the work with schizophrenia.
Dakle, na ovom workshopu, na ovoj radionici ću se fokusirati samo na to što smo radili sa šizofrenim pacijentima.
The scope of what we need to do is going to be so huge that to get it all into 1.5 hours is going to be interesting.
Sve ono što smo radili, dakle, mnogo je za ova 2 sata, tako da izdvojit će ono što je najinteresantnije.
And I want to thank very much my patient translators who have to put up with me.
I želim da se zahvalim strpljivim prevodiocima koji idu korak sa mnom.
If you see them gesturing to me, they're allowed to do that.
Ako vidite da mi nešto gestikuliraju, dozvoljeno im je da to rade.
Because when I get excited, I might start using long sentences.
Jer kad se uzbudim mogu da koristim duge rečenice. Please don't do that.
Yeah. So it's for all of you that they're allowed to tell me, stop.
Ok, znači za sve nas je dozvoljeno da mu pokažemo ovako jedan znak koji smo dogovorili ranije kako bi usporio.
Okay, so let's start talking about transaction analysis and normal development to sort of give you a base.
Hajde da počnemo da pričamo o transakcionalnoj analizi i normalnom razvoju da bih vam dao osnovu.
And since the development of schizophrenia already occurs in the first year of life,
s obzirom na to da razvoj šizofrenije dakle počinje već u prvoj godini života,
that's going to be the area that I will focus on the most.
To će biti zapravo period na koji ću se fokusirati najviše.
So what I'd like to talk about is the development of ego states.
Ono o čemu želim da pričam jeste razvoj ego stanja.
So that you have some idea about what are ego states, and then we can use that to talk about schizophrenia itself.
Da biste imali ideju o tome šta su zapravo ego stanja i kako bismo onda mogli da govorimo o tome kako se schizofrenija razvija.
So I found out something this morning technically that I think is going to help us.
Jutro sam saznao nešto što ima veze sa tehničkim mogućnostima, što mislim da će nam pomoći.
And it's this whiteboard function.
Ovo je bela tabla, whiteboard.
When we talk about ego states,
kada pričamo o ego stanjima,
then we talk about, they're often drawn in 3 circles.
Obično su nacrtane kao 3 kruga.
Now, I'm very bad at drawing, so I ask you for your patience with this.
Loš sam u crtanju, tako da molim vas za strpljenje.
For this experiment, let's just imagine they're perfect circles.
Za ovaj eksperiment zamislimo samo da su savršeni krugovi.
When a baby is born,
kada se beba rodi,
they enter the attachment relationship with the mother.
Ostvari dakle attachment sa majkom, afektivnu povezanost.
And they have to do this to survive.
I moraju to da urade da bi preživeli.
We humans are born neurologically so underdeveloped.
Mi smo ljudi rođeni u neurološkom smislu prilično nerazvijeni.
That we can't survive on our own.
Tako da ne možemo da preživimo sami.
And we're very limited in how we can communicate with the mother.
I vrlo smo ograničeni u tome kako možemo da komuniciramo sa majkom.
So we have to find ways to communicate that are non-verbal.
Tako da moramo da pronađemo načine za komunikaciju koji nisu verbalni.
And the transaction analysis divides the psyche into 3 major areas.
Transakcionalna analiza deli psihu u 3 glavne oblasti, područja.
And these 3 areas are shown in these 3 circles.
I ove tri područja, oblasti su pokazana zapravo kroz ova 3 kruga.
I'm sorry that it's so scratchy, but I have to write in an odd angle.
Žao mi je što je ovako nažvrljano, ali prosto to radim u jednom vrlo čudnom uglu. Iz jednog čudnog ugla.
These 3 circles are called the ego states.
Ova 3 kruga se nazivaju ego stanja.
And the first ego state that I will talk about it's often called the parent ego state. I prefer the original term of exteropsyche.
Prvo ego stanje u kojem ću govoriti se naziva zapravo ego stanje roditelja. Ja preferiram stari naziv koji je zapravo eksteropsiha.
Now the exteropsyche is the only one whose content is not developed out of your own personality.
Eksteropsiha je jedino dakle ego stanje koje nije razvijeno iz sopstvene ličnosti.
It is not syntonic with the rest of our personality.
Nije sintono, dakle, sa ostatkom naše ličnosti.
And that's why we call it the exteropsyche.
Zato i zovemo eksteropsiha.
And for a long time, we use the term parent ego states to help explain what's the content of it.
Dugo smo koristili izraz egostanje roditelja da bismo objasnili sadržaj ovog egostanja.
But I prefer to use the term exteropsyche.
Ali ja preferiram, dakle, eksteropsiha.
So this is the ego state that contains everything that we have imported into our personality.
Ovo egostanje sadrži, dakle, sve one sadržaje koje smo mi nekako uneli u svoju ličnost.
And one way to understand it is to see it as a collection of everything that we've been attached to.
Jedan način da ga vidimo jeste, da vidimo ovo egostanje, jeste zapravo kao kolekcija svega onoga što smo uneli u sebe.
Then we have the neopsyche.
Onda imamo neopsihu.
The neopsyche is the ego state where we are adequate.
Neopsiha jeste egostanje gde smo mi zapravo adekvatni.
Where we use all the resources at our disposal.
Gde koristimo sve one resurse koje su nam na raspolaganju.
Relevant to the context in which we find ourselves.
Relevantni za one kontekste u kojima se nalazimo.
Because obviously the context determines, the environment determines how we think, feel, behave, our values.
Jer zapravo kontekst određuje to kako ćemo se osjećati, misliti i ponašati.
So when we behave adequately in the moment, in the context which we are in,
kada se ponašamo, dakle, adekvatno u kontekstu u kome se nalazimo,
using all of our resources,
koristeći sve svoje resurse,
that comes out of the neopsyche.
to dolazi iz neopsihe.
We cathect our neopsyche.
Zapravo kažemo da smo katektirali neopsihu.
We fill this part of our personality.
Napunili smo ovaj deo ličnosti energijom.
And then we have the archaeopsyche.
I na kraju imamo arheopsihu.
Archaeo out of the past.
Arheo znači da dolazi iz prošlosti.
And Eric Berne described this as a regressive ego state.
Eric Berne je arheopsihu objasnio kao regresivno egostanje.
So when we come out of the archaeopsyche, we're responding from trauma.
Kada zapravo reagujemo iz arheopsihe, reagujemo iz traume.
And the different ways we learned to deal with trauma.
I zapravo iz različitih načina na koje smo naučili da se nosimo sa tim traumama.
And it of course pulls us out of being adequate.
Sorry, can you repeat, please?
It pulls us out of being adequate.
I zapravo izvlači iz nas da budemo...
Stavlja nas na mesto odakle više nismo adekvatni.
Hvala.
Reagujemo neadekvatno.
Neadekvatno.
We react as though we were back in the situation where we had the original trauma.
Reagujemo onako kako smo reagovali u situaciji koja je bila originalna, dakle kad smo doživjeli traumu.
Or out of the coping mechanisms that we developed.
Ili kroz coping mehanizam koji smo razvili tada.
That we developed to deal with that trauma.
Koji smo zapravo razvili da bismo se nekako nosili sa tom traumom.
Okay, so when a baby cries,
kada beba plače,
it comes from the neopsyche.
To dolazi iz neopsihe.
Because it's adequate for the context in which it finds itself.
Zato što je adekvatno onom kontekstu u kome se ona našla.
And it uses all the resources.
I koristi sve resurse.
And what happens is that the baby cries in the direction of the mother.
I ono što se dešava jeste zapravo da beba plače u pravcu majke.
And in normal development, the mother has a little inner dialogue with her own internalized mother.
I ono što se dešava, dakle, u normalnoj komunikaciji, u normalnom razvoju, jeste da mama zapravo ima unutrašnji dijalog sa svojim unutrašnjim roditeljem.
And for this example, let's say she responds adequately.
I za ovaj primjer, hajde da kažemo da je odgovorila adekvatno.
So she sees that the baby is hungry.
Dakle, vidi da je beba gladna.
And she gives the baby the breast.
I da bebi dojku.
what happens is for the baby that the stress of being hungry gets relieved.
Ono što se dešava sa bebom, dakle, da je to što je dakle, uzrojena zato što je gladna, se dolazi do olakšanja.
And it makes a little image of the mother.
I zapravo stvara jednu malu sliku majke.
A mother who is caring.
Majke koja je brižna.
And this is then stored in the external psyche.
I to se onda, dakle, smesti, dakle, i čuva u eksteropsihi.
And when this happens within an attachment relationship,
kada se to desi, dakle, u jednom odnosu,
then the baby will also begin to develop an attachment relationship to this ego state.
Beba zapravo napravi i odnos, attachment, povezano sa tim ego stanjem.
And later, around the age of 10, will then incorporate into its own personality.
A negdje kasnije, na prilike oko 10. godine, će to inkorporirati u ostatak svoje ličnosti.
Now, let's say that the response from the mother is inadequate.
Ajde da kažemo sada da je odgovor majke neadekvatan.
For instance, the mother has the value, let children cry, it's good for their nervous system.
Recimo da majka ima određeni stav, pustimo dete da plače, to je dobro za njegov ili njen nervni sistem.
So the baby cries and gets no response.
Dakle, beba plače i ne dobija nikakav odgovor.
What happens is that it then, in addition to creating an image of the mother which is not caring,
ono što se dešava jeste zapravo da se stvara slika majke koja nije brižna.
It also stores the energy of this crisis in the archaeopsyche.
Takođe, skladišti se, taloži se ta energija, dakle, u arheopsihi.
Because this is like a fixation of a traumatic experience.
Ovo je zapravo kao ta neka fiksacija traumatskog iskustva.
And this gets stored in the archaeopsyche.
Ona se dakle nalazi, smesti se u arheopsihu.
And if this continues, the baby will stop crying because it doesn't get an adequate response.
Ako se ovo nastavi, beba će jednostavno prestati da plače zato što ne dobija adekvatan odgovor.
So it will learn the denial of its needs as a response to this traumatic experience.
Zapravo će naučiti da se njegove potrebe ne zadovoljavaju kao reakcija na ovo traumatsko iskustvo.
So we have some idea as to how the ego states get made.
So we have an idea
as to how the ego states develop.
Sada dakle imamo ideju kako se ego stanja razvijaju.
Jelena, hoćeš zamenu?
Okay, next.
Okay, good. So now if we have this, then if you have some understanding of that, then we can get back to talking about schizophrenia.
Ako ste razumeli ovo, možemo da nastavimo da pričamo o šizofreniji.
Now, schizophrenia is a disorder, it's a psychotic disorder.
Šizofrenija je psihotični poremećaj.
And what it means for it to be a psychotic disorder is that when people are in the psychosis,
to znači da kad su ljudi u psihozi,
they respond to the world without really having a relationship to it.
Odgovaraju na svet iako zaista nemaju vezu sa njim.
So they leave their basis for reality.
I onda napuštaju svoju osnovu za realnost.
And there's very specific development patterns that cause this to happen.
I postoje vrlo specifični paterni kako se ovo dešava.
And part of that is based on the fact that they experience a traumatic relationship.
I deo toga se zasniva na iskustvu traumatičnih odnosa.
In every single developmental stage.
U svakom razvojnom stadiju.
Now, this is essential.
Ovo je važno.
If they don't get a confirmation of this pathological development, this pathological relationship,
ako ne dobiju potvrdu iz ovog patološkog odnosa,
they may have some psychotic systems,
mogu imati neke psihotične sisteme,
or they may develop a personality disorder,
ili mogu razviti poremećaj ličnosti.
but they won't develop a psychosis.
ali neće razviti psihozu.
So let's look at those patterns.
Ajde da pogledamo ove paterne.
For the development of schizophrenia, there are two major aspects that we can bundle the rest of into them.
Kod razvoja šizofrenije postoje dva važna aspekta i sve ostalo tu možemo da grupišemo u ta dva.
The first aspect is a thinking disorder.
Prvi aspekt je poremećaj mišljenja.
A thinking disorder that may take one of two different forms.
Poremećaj mišljenja može da bude u dva oblika.
The first one is a thinking disorder in terms of content.
Prvi je poremećaj mišljenja u odnosu na sadržaj.
Now, this is when if I would hallucinate.
Kada bih halucinirao.
And I have hallucinations that are contained within a common system.
I imam halucinacije koje su sadržane u opštem sistemu.
Let's say I feel that I am being followed by people with dark hair.
Recimo da osjećam da me prate ljudi sa crnom tamnom kosom.
And in every situation, if there's somebody there with dark hair, I would think they're following me.
I u svakoj situaciji da se nađem sa osobom koja ima tamnu kosu, osjećat ću da me prati.
Now, that would be an example of this.
Can I stop you just a second?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Molba za prevodioce da sačekate malo nakon što Ravi završi rečenicu, jer ako krenete odmah da prevodite, onda mu se izgubi krajnji deo rečenice pa ne mogu da čuju. It's just a small ask from translators, because if they're translating next to what you said, then we don't hear you. It's
okay.
it's going together because of internet, and so they have to wait a little bit after you say. Sorry.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay, so this is an example of a thinking disorder where it's in terms of content.
Ovo je primer poremećaja mišljenja po sadržaju.
The other kind of thinking disorder
Druga vrsta poremećaja mišljenja
is a formal thinking disorder.
Je poremećaj po formi.
And this is where we would have trouble organizing our thoughts or input.
Ovde imamo problem sa organizovanjem naših misli i inputa.
So somebody would ask me, how are you?
Ako me neko pita kako sam,
and I would answer with, it's raining, isn't it?
Odgovorit ću sa, pada kiša, zar ne?
And look at all the dead fish on the floor.
I pogledaj svu tu mrtvu ribu po podu.
And do you know that sometimes it hurts if you look at your toe?
Da li znaš da nekad boli kad gledaš u svoj nožni prst?
This kind of disconnected thinking
Ovo diskonektovano mišljenje
is what we call a formal thinking disorder.
nazivamo poremećaj mišljenja po formi.
And there must be in periods of decompensation.
I pojavljaju se u periodima dekompenzacije.
There will be one or the other form of thinking disorder.
Biće jedna ili druga vrsta poremećaja mišljenja.
One other major point of schizophrenia or symptom
druga stvar koja je važna za šizofreniju, odnosno simptom,
is the life pattern.
Je životni obrazac.
And when the disorder is fresh, then the decompensation is dramatic.
Kada je poremećaj nov, onda je dekompenzacija traumatična.
The time when the patient goes into being disconnected is dramatic.
Vreme u kojem pacijent bude dekompenzovan je dramatično.
It's also short.
Takođe i kratko traje.
And over time, we will see that the decompensation stretches out, gets longer.
Vremenom ćemo uvideti da se dekompenzacija razvlači i postaje duža.
But it loses its dramatic.
Ali gubi na svojoj traumatičnosti.
And over time, it's difficult. The person's just psychotic all the time.
I vremenom postaje teže i osoba postaje psihotična sve vreme.
So we talk about at the beginning of the dramatic prodromal phase.
Kad pričamo o početku predominalne faze,
Prodromalne faze.
prodromalne faze.
And later we talk about the residual symptoms.
A posle ćemo pričati o rezidualnim simptomima.
And officially to diagnose someone with schizophrenia, they need to have decompensated at least twice.
I zvanično znam da ako neko ima šizofreniju, treba da bude dekompenzovan najmanje 2 puta.
And this is common for all the different types or forms of schizophrenia.
Ovo važi ili je uobičajeno za sve vrste šizofrenije.
Now, let's start with talking about the different kinds of schizophrenia.
Hajde da pričamo o različitim vrstama šizofrenije.
And obviously, because of the limits on the time,
Zbog ograničenog vremena,
I won't go into too much detail about each one,
neću detaljisati o svakoj.
but I want to give those people who don't have experience with this some idea.
Ali voleo bi da vam dam bar nekakvu predstavu, posebno ljudima koji nisu informisani o ovom.
The diagnosis terms that I use,
Termini koje koristim za dijagnozu,
I will attempt to adapt them to the terms that I use today.
Adaptirat ću ih sa terminima koje ću koristiti danas.
But at the point which we were existing, we used the terms that were relevant then.
Ali ću koristiti terminima koji su adekvatni sada.
And I like to use a diagnostic book, the American one, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Americans.
Knjigu koju koristim je američki dijagnostički priručnik,
The DSM.
DSM.
Although I'm not so happy with the newest version.
Iako nisam baš zadovoljan najnovijom verzijom.
Because as tends to happen, they overdo it.
Čini mi se kao da su preterali.
So I prefer to use one of the older ones.
Zato preferiram starije verzije.
But I can, if requested, speak the modern one.
Ukoliko zahtevate, mogu da pričam i o modernu.
And I don't like to use the international classification.
Ne volim da koristim međunarodnu klasifikaciju.
Because my impression is that it's very watered down.
Zato što mi je utisak da je veoma razvodnjen.
That is not clear enough.
Nije dovoljno jasno.
And that's just my personal opinion, of course.
To je samo moje lično mišljenje.
Okay, the first form of schizophrenia is hebephrenia.
Prva vrsta šizofrenije je hebefrena šizofrenija.
And the term that's used these days is called schizophrenia disorganized type.
I termin koji se sada koristi je šizofrenija dezorganizovani tip.
And the reason that this term is used is because they have a formal thinking disorder.
I taj termin se koristi zato što sadrži, odnosno imaju poremećaj mišljenja po formi.
So when somebody decompensates into this form of schizophrenia,
I kad se neko dekompenzuje u ovoj vrsti šizofrenije,
they don't even have the capacity to think clearly associative.
Nemaju kapaciteta da jasno misle u asocijacijama.
So their thoughts are not organized.
Dakle, misli im nisu organizovane.
And of course, the thoughts determine the behaviors attached to them.
A naravno, misli organizuju i ponašanje koje je vezano za njih.
So to the official diagnostic criteria, we have that they are dissociative and they can't think clearly.
Znači, po zvaničnim kriterijumima, oni su disocijativni i ne mogu da razmišljaju na pravi način.
Their affect and their behaviors will be experienced as being flat and inadequate.
Afekti i ponašanje će im biti ravni i neadekvatni.
And these are the two major symptoms.
I to su dva glavna simptoma.
Now, having lived with people with this diagnosis,
S obzirom da sam živeo sa ljudima koji imaju ovu dijagnozu
who were not on antipsychotic medication,
i nisu bili na antipsihoticima,
I can tell you that there's a lot more to it.
mogu vam reći da tu ima dosta toga.
And one of the symptoms that people with this diagnosis have
I jedan od simptoma koji ljudi s ovom dijagnozom imaju
is an incredible ability to discount even sensation.
je neverovatna mogućnost da otpišu čak i senzacije.
By discounting sensation, I mean they don't feel when they're escalated.
Kada kažem da otpišu senzacije, mislim na to da oni ne mogu da osete kada to eskalira.
And this is at a physical level.
I to na fizičkom nivou.
I can give you many examples of this.
Daću vam više primjera.
One of the most pathological patients that we had.
Jedan od najpatološkijih pacijenata koji smo imali.
She was hospitalized when she was 14.
Bila je hospitalizovana sa 14 godina.
And spent much of her life in the hospitals until she came to us.
I provela je dobar deo života po bolnicama pre nego što je došla kod nas.
And she had a lot of scars.
Imala je dosta ožiljaka.
And one of the scars she had was in the side of her body.
I jedan od ožiljaka je bio sa strane njenog tela.
Where she'd obviously cut herself.
Koji je očigledno ona uradila sebi.
And we asked her where that came from.
Pitali smo je odakle je to.
In a moment where she wasn't decompensated.
U trenutku kada nije bila dekompenzovana.
And she said she heard a sound in her stomach, so she cut herself open to see what's in it.
Odgovorila je da je čula glas u svom stomaku i zato ga je otvorila da bi videla šta se nalazi to unutra.
Now, this was pure curiosity.
A ovo je bila čista radoznalost.
And very crazy.
I vrlo ludo.
And that's just one example.
I to je samo jedan primjer.
One of the problems that people have is that people with this diagnosis have is that they're sometimes defined as being anorectic.
Jedan od problema koje ljudi sa ovim problemom imaju je da se definišu kao anoreksični.
But the fact of the matter is that they just don't feel hunger.
Ali u stvari radi se o tome da jednostavno ne osjećaju glad.
And they may not feel when they have eaten enough.
A isto tako nemaju osjećaj ni kad su jeli dovoljno.
Because even within the first 3 months of life, they cut off being able to feel hunger.
Jer su već u prva 3 meseca svog života otpisali taj osjećaj da su gladni.
So when I worked in a psychiatric hospital doing training,
I dok sam radio na psihijatrijskoj bolnici kao stažista,
we had a patient come and he looked very, very thin and very anorectic.
Došao nam je pacijent koji je izgledao vrlo mršavo i vrlo anoreksično.
And he was also psychotic.
I takođe je bio psihotičan.
And the staff wanted to diagnose him as having anorexia.
Osoblje je htelo da mu da dijagnozu da je anoreksičan.
And I asked one of the male nurses to take him to the cafeteria.
I ja sam zamolio jednog bolničara da ga odvede u menzu.
And to order 12 sausages.
I da mu naruči 12 kobasica.
And just one after the other, put one on his plate.
I da mu stavlja na tanjir jednu za drugom.
He ate 4 of them before the nurse said that's enough.
Uspeo je da pojede 4 kobasice pre nego što je bolničar rekao dosta.
He didn't feel hungry and he didn't feel when he was satisfied.
On nije osetio ni da je gladan, a ni da je bio sit.
And this is very common for people with this kind of schizophrenia.
I to je uobičajeno za ljude sa ovom vrstom šizofrenije.
And food plays an important role in the treatment of this.
I hrana igra važnu ulogu u lečenju, u tretmanu ovih osoba.
Okay, this disorder forms within the first 3 months of life.
Ovaj poremećaj nastaje u prva 3 meseca života.
And one of the important things about this disorder
I jedna od najvažnijih stvari vezanih za ovu vrstu poremećaja
is that the babies are not taken care of either physically or emotionally.
je to da se o bebama ne brine ni emocionalno, ni fizički.
And to survive, they develop adaptations that are not normal.
I da bi preživeli, oni razvijaju adaptacije koje nisu normalne.
The deep fear with somebody with this diagnosis
Duboki strah osoba sa tom dijagnozom
is to be abandoned.
je da budu ostavljeni.
It's not a fear of being rejected, it's a fear of being abandoned.
Znači, nije strah od toga da budu odbačeni, već da budu ostavljeni.
And it's the most difficult form of schizophrenia to treat.
I to je najteža forma šizofrenije za lečenje.
The prognosis is very, very small.
Prognoze su vrlo, vrlo male. Next, please.
In most situations, these people are medicated and they spend their lives in hospitals.
U većini situacija ovi ljudi završe u bolnicama.
And but we have them unmedicated in our program.
Ali u našem programu im nismo davali lekove.
And the term we use for people with this diagnosis was hebephrenia.
I to je jedan od načina kako smo radili sa hebefrenom šizofrenijom.
I zvali smo ovu formu šizofrenije hebefrena šizofrenija. Dakle, radili smo bez lekova, inače su to obično ljudi koji su pod lekovima veći deo svog života.
Thank you, I couldn't say it better. Okay, the next form of schizophrenia that I will talk about, just because it's the most common,
Sljedeći tip šizofrenije o kome ću govoriti je jednostavno jedan od najčešćih.
Is paranoia.
Jeste paranoidna šizofrenija.
And I think this is something that most of us have at some times in our lives have had contact with someone with this.
Can you repeat that?
Most of us have at some point in our lives
Većina nas je u životu
have been exposed to someone with this disorder.
Bila izložena sa nekim ko ima ovaj tip poremećaja.
One of the things that is obvious with them
Jedna očigledna stvar kod njih
is that when they turn psychotic,
je to što kada postanu psihotični,
they have a closed frame of reference.
Imaju jako mali krug referenci.
Imaju zatvoren referentni okvir.
It has its own logic within itself.
Tako da imaju neku celokupnu logiku samo unutar svog kruga.
But the content is psychotic.
Ali sadržaj je psihotičan.
And so they may feel persecuted.
Tako da se često mogu osjećati kada su proganjani.
They may have ideas of relationship where there's none.
Mogu da imaju ideje o odnosu tamo gde uopšte ne postoji odnos.
They will probably hallucinate.
Verovatno haluciniraju.
You know, you'll be talking with them, all of a sudden and then they look back to you, and then they'll have conversations with somebody else.
Često se dešava da u toku razgovora jednostavno odlutaju i vraćaju se i tako u krug.
I had somebody in the hospital who the coffee machine used to talk to him.
Imao sam iskustvo gde je sa jednim pacijentom navodno razgovarao aparat za kafu sa njim.
So he had auditory hallucinations.
Što znači da je imao auditivne halucinacije.
And they are organized, but the frame of reference has nothing to do with the reality around them.
Jesu organizovane, ali referentni okvir nema ništa da u odnosu sa ljudima koji ih okružuju i sa stvarima.
Referentni okvir nema dodir sa realnošću, iako je unutar referentnog okvira logika organizovana.
And the hallucinations are persecutory and grandiose.
Ideje su proganjajuće i grandiozne.
Some of the other symptoms
Neki od ostalih simptoma
is that they will get aggressive when they feel scared.
je to da će postati agresivni kada se uplaše.
In TA, we would say they racket anger over fear.
U TA bi to nazvali reket sistemom ljutnje i besa.
And when they get scared, the more scared they get, the more they escalate their anger.
I što su više uplašeni, to više eskalira bes.
And they can get to be very loud.
I mogu biti dosta glasni.
And very threatening.
I dosta preteći.
Something else that they do is that they provoke.
Tako da, do they think that they are provoked or that
they provoke? They provoke.
Stoga oni imaju tendenciju da provociraju.
So they will do things that are socially inappropriate.
Tako da rade stvari koje nisu jednostavno socijalno prihvatljive.
And they do this to get negative attention.
I rade ovo kako bi privukli negativni stil pažnje, to jest negativnu pažnju.
And this has to do with the development age at which this disorder starts.
I ovo ima veze sa godinama u razvoju kada je ovo krenulo.
For the paranoids, this starts at the first separation stage.
Kod paranoidnih to je u razvojnom stadijumu prva godina. Prvi stadijum.
Prve separacije.
Around 9 months of age.
Oko 9. meseca života.
Now, this is the age where the baby can.
Ovo je period kada beba može.
Under its own power, move away from the mother.
Kada samostalno može da se fizički skloni od majke.
You know, so they separate from the mother by realizing that they have the motoric skills to do it.
Tako da se sklanjaju od majke zato što su svesni da su u stanju da to motorički urade.
And this changes the relationship between the mother and the child.
I ovo menja odnos između majke i deteta.
Now, the mother has carried the baby for 9 months in her body.
Majka je nosila tu bebu 9 meseci u stomaku.
And then she's carried the baby for 9 months on her arms.
I nosila je bebu 9 meseci u naručju.
In her lap.
U krilu.
So she's relieved when the baby can be distracted by the world.
Tako da je zapravo zadovoljna s time što dete može biti posvećeno nečim drugim, to jest da može da se odvoji od nje.
And the baby is curious and has an attachment to the mother.
I onda je beba radoznala povodom njenog attachmenta i vezivanja za majku.
Beba je i radoznala i vezana za majku istovremeno.
And is excited to be able to move into the world and leave the mother.
I uzbuđena je tom činjenicom da može da se odvoji od majke i da istraži svet.
So in normal development for both of them, this is a happy thing.
Pod normalnim okolnostima ovo je jedna zadovoljavajuća stvar.
But in this situation, something happens.
Ali u ovoj situaciji se nešto drugačije dešava.
It may have to do with the development of the mother.
Možda ima veze sa razvojem majke.
Very often it has to do with physical things that happen at this time.
Često ima veze sa fizičkim stvarima koje su se dešavale u tom periodu.
You know, for instance, the baby may be teething.
Na primjer, možda je beba pomoć.
What did you say, baby, maybe?
Teething.
Rastu je zubi.
Aha, možda je rastu zubi.
And when the baby is teething, of course, then they want to hang on the mother.
Tako da je sasvim normalno da kada bebi rastu zubi, želi da se privrži majci.
And they get this kind of whiny voice.
I imaju taj neki kukajući glas.
You know, they go, eh. They're not satisfied with anything.
Nisu zadovoljni jednostavno ničim.
They'll probably get a cold.
Verovatno će se razboliti, to jest prehladiti.
They might get diarrhea.
Može dobiju dijareju.
And they feel bad.
I osjete to.
And so they hang on the mother.
I zato postaju privrženi majci.
Now, the mother experiences a loss of her freedom with that.
Sad majka osjeti gubitak svoje sopstvene slobode sa tim potezom.
And she was just getting used to it.
A taman se navikla na to.
And so she experienced this as a problem.
Tako da majka to doživljava kao vid problema.
I can remember when our oldest daughter was this age.
Sećam se kad je moja najstarija ćerka bila tih godina.
And I had a workshop for the day and I was away.
I zbog potreba radionica nisam bio tu par dana.
When I came home through the door, my wife was waiting.
Kad sam došao nazad, moja žena me je čekala.
Behind the door.
Iza vrata.
And she said, "Here, your baby."
I rekla, izvoli, evo tvoja beba.
I asked her later, I said, "What would you have done if it was the postman?"
I ja sam je pitao šta bi uradila da je bio u pitanju poštar.
She said it wouldn't matter.
Rekla je, ne bi bilo važno.
I would have said, "Here, your baby."
Rekla bi mu, evo ti, izvoli bebu.
Because she was so frustrated with the baby hanging on her all day.
Jer je bila jednostavno dovoljno frustrirana zato što je beba ceo dan bila uz nju.
Now it's actually good for the mother to have this.
To je zapravo dobro da majka to osjeti.
It makes it easier for her to separate when the baby feels good again.
To znači da joj ceo taj proces olakšava period separacije kada beba ponovo se osjeti dobro.
You know, and most of the mothers give the baby to the father and go and talk to somebody about this and come down from their frustration.
I većina majki jednostavno da bebu ocu, razgovaraju sa nekim o tome i smire se.
And they can then reattach to the baby.
I zatim mogu ponovo da se povežu sa detetom. Imaju dovoljno energije za to.
But in this case, they often feel guilty about it or have some other reason.
Ali se često majke osjećaju krivim baš zbog tog osjećaja koji imaju.
And what happens is that they pull back out of the attachment.
I ono što se dešava jeste da se povlače iz tog odnosa, iz vezivanja.
Because they feel that kind of frustration every time they're with the baby.
Zato što osjete taj vid frustracije svaki put kada su sa bebom.
And the baby, of course, then feels rejected.
I onda se beba naravno osjeća zapostavljenom i odbijenom.
So this is a different relationship conflict than for hebephrenia.
Tako da je ovaj vid u paranoidnoj šizofreniji drugačiji od hebefrene, šizofrenije koju smo pomenuli.
The problem there is abandonment.
Problem tamo je napuštanje.
And the problem here is rejection.
A problem ovde je odbijanje.
And the baby feels this rejection.
I beba, šta kaže?
Kaže odbacivanje.
Da. Okay. Beba, znači, ovdje osjeti odbacivanje.
And develops adaptations.
I razvija personalne adaptacije.
To deal with that.
Da bi mogla da se nosi sa tim poteškoćama.
And since the mother is not playing with the baby anymore.
I s obzirom da se majka više ne igra u tom momentu sa bebom.
The baby experiences that it needs to do something else to get attention.
Beba osjeti da mora nešto drugo, nešto novo da uradi kako bi se povezala.
And the easiest way to do that is to provoke the mother.
I najlakši način da to ostvari jeste da provocira majku.
So the way to get attention is through provocation.
Tako da način na koji će beba dobiti pažnju jeste kroz provokaciju.
And they pull themselves back and develop their own internal frame of reference.
Tako da se zapravo povlače u sebe i stvaraju svoj referentni okvir.
And through provocation they keep people separate.
I kroz provokaciju prave separaciju ljudi u svojoj okolini.
And so they grow up isolated as a result of that.
Tako da to rezultira odrastanjem zapravo sa osjećajem izolovanosti.
And they refer to this internal frame of reference as a reality of the world.
I izveštavaju zapravo o svom referentnom okviru kao da je deo realnosti zaista.
but it's based on an idea that they will be rejected if they enter any kind of attachment.
A zapravo je zasnovan na jednoj ideji da ukoliko se vežu, bit će odbijeni, to jest odbačeni.
Now, this is the core of the paranoid personality.
Ovo je suština paranoidnog poremećaja ličnosti.
And of course, again, they have to experience this relationship pattern in each stage of development.
I moraju taj strah od odbacivanja da testiraju u svakom razvojnom periodu.
Iskuse.
And please be aware, I'm keeping this at a very basic level just because of time.
I imajte na umu da zaista se trudim da ovo držim na nekom bazičnom nivou zato što imamo mali vremenski rok.
So I don't go into too much detail.
Tako da ne idem na previše detalja. Next, ako može.
Now, the other form of...
Just a moment, Ravi. They're going to change translators, and because we have such a short time today, we agreed to organize a much longer workshop.
Yeah.
So you're going to have a chance to learn more and to ask more.
It's just that we have another half an hour.
S obzirom da imamo malo vremena danas, bit će organizovana celodnevna radionica gdje ćete moći da dobijete više informacija, ali i da pitate više. I bit će informacija o tome.
Today I'm going to talk about the healing of all schizophrenias.
Danas ću pričati o lečenju svih oblika šizofrenije.
And obviously I can't go into detail with each one.
I naravno neću moći da ulazim u detalje svake od njih.
Because some of the interventions are different.
Zato što su naravno nekada intervencije različite.
Okay, so this is the paranoid type of schizophrenia.
Dobro, dakle to je bio paranoidni tip šizofrenije.
The other form of schizophrenia.
Drugi oblik šizofrenije.
And this is the kind that in modern terminology is called undifferentiated schizophrenia.
I modernim rečnikom ona se zove indiferencirana šizofrenija.
And we called it paraphrenia.
Mi je zovemo parafrenija.
Because it develops between the hebephrenics and the paranoids.
Zato što se razvija između heberfrene i paranoidne.
Between the 3rd month and the 9th month.
Između 3. i 9. meseca života.
And if people develop the relationship crisis more towards the end of it, they'll be more paranoid.
Ako ljudi razviju veze više ka 9. mesecu, bit će više paranoidni.
And if it's more towards the beginning, they'll tend to be more behaviorally hebephrenic.
A ako je više ka početku, imaće tendenciju da budu heberfreni.
But one of the common factors for this diagnosis,
ali zajednički faktor za ovu dijagnozu je
they have the psychotic symptoms of being disorganized in their minds and their behavior.
Imaju psihotični poremećaj i dezorganizovane misli i ponašanje.
But they also have a major problem with showing how sick they are.
Ali također imaju problem da pokažu to koliko su bolesni.
They develop a high level of social competence.
Razvijaju visok nivo socijalnih kompetencija.
But what they do is that they transform the stimulation that they get.
Ali ono što zapravo radi jeste da transformišu stimuluse koje dobijaju.
To conform to a very obsessive internal frame of reference.
U jedan obsesivni referentni okvir.
And they develop between the 3rd and the 9th month.
Razvija se između 3. i 9. meseca života.
And maybe one picture to have for the kind of situation that develops.
I evo jedna slika na koji način se to razvija, da biste imali predstavu.
You have a baby who is lying in its crib and moving itself, trying to get attention.
Imate bebu koja leži u kolevci i pokreće se kako bi dobila pažnju.
And a mother who might be depressive.
I majku koja je možda depresivna.
Who's not relating to the baby.
Koja nije povezana sa bebom.
but she's organizing the diapers to make sure they're in a straight line.
Ali ređe pelene tako da budu u jednoj pravoj liniji.
And she's tidying up and cleaning up the room.
Čisti i rasprema sobu.
So the baby is well taken care of physically.
Tako da je beba negovana na fizički način.
And this is This is in contrast to the Schizophrenics who are discounted both physically and emotionally.
I ovo je suprotno od šizofrenije gdje su bebe i fizički i psihički, gdje su im fizički i psihički nezadovoljene potrebe.
In this situation, the baby is taken care of physically.
U ovoj situaciji beba je zbrinuta u fizičkom smislu.
But there's no attachment.
Ali nema attachmenta.
So there's an extreme abandonment at the emotional level.
Tako da postoji veliko napuštanje u tom emocionalnom smislu.
So what the babies develop is a kind of internal hospitalization.
Ono što je beba razvila je unutrašnja, može pomoći Sandra.
Did you say hospitalization?
Yeah, like a kind of repetitive behavior to stimulate themselves.
Repetitivno ponašanje da bi stimulisali sami sebe zapravo.
For instance, you'll see them banging their heads against the pillow.
Kao rocking. Like rocking?
Yeah, like rocking or...
Okay, because the hospitalization means something else. It means to be in hospital. So
yeah, well, this is something that they've seen with babies in hospitals. That's where the term comes from.
Okay, like rocking and self-soothing and things.
Yeah, stimulating themselves.
Bebe razvijaju repetitivne obrasce ponašanja kojim stimulišu same sebe.
I saw somebody on the chat that seemed to have a good word for it. And that later transforms
to se kasnije pretvori u
into a kind of thinking disorder.
Poremećaj mišljenja.
That they experience as being the reality itself.
Iskustvo im je odvojeno od realnosti.
And so if you say something to them,
ako im nešto kažete,
they will answer, and the answer doesn't quite fit what you said.
Oni će odgovoriti, ali odgovor se baš ne uklapa u ono što ste pitali, što ste vi rekli.
And it's only when you have a longer conversation that you realize that they are absolutely disconnected with reality.
I samo koliko imate duži razgovor, shvatit ćete da su oni u potpunosti diskonektovani od realnosti.
On the outside, they seem like they seem depressive, but they don't stand out.
Spolja oni izgledaju depresivno, ali se ne ističu.
As a matter of fact, we had a therapist who we didn't know.
Čak što više imali smo terapeuta za koga nismo znali.
And she presented a client to us at a conference.
I predstavila nam je klijente na konferenciji.
And we had no time to meet her, so we invited her to come to a party that we were giving.
Nismo imali priliku da upoznamo, pa smo je pozvali na zabavu koju smo organizovali.
And the next day we were talking about it and saying, well, this patient is obviously quite dramatic.
I sljedećeg dana smo pričali o tome kako je pacijent
and looks for lots of attention and things.
I kako traži dosta pažnje i slično.
And then we called them in to come talk with us.
I pozvali smo ga da dođe popriča sa nama.
And it turned out that the person we thought was a patient was a therapist.
Ispostavilo se da osoba za koju smo mislili da je pacijent je zapravo terapeut.
And the person who was a patient was beige, she was what we call wallflowers. She didn't stand out.
A osoba koja je bila pacijent je zapravo bila bež, odnosno nije se isticala.
So this is some of what happens with paraphrenia.
Ovo je nešto što se dešava sa parafrenijom.
The people usually come with depressive symptoms to begin with for therapy.
Na početku dolaze sa depresivnim simptomima, to jest na terapiju.
And it's only over time that we realize that they have psychotic symptoms.
I tokom vremena shvatimo da imaju određene psihotične simptome.
Okay, that's your small teaser for the different kinds of schizophrenia.
I to je bio mali teaser za različite vrste šizofrenije.
I'm not going to talk very much about the catatonics because we just don't see them often enough at the moment.
Neću pričati o katetanoj zato što ih u ovom trenutku ne vidimo često.
Okay, so what does this kind of development mean for somebody in terms of the development of their ego states?
Šta ovo sve, kako sve ovo značenje ima u formi razvoja ego stanja?
What it means is that
To znači
that when they deal with the major caretaker,
kada su u odnosu sa starateljem,
the baby cries and gets a response
beba plače i dobije odgovor,
that is not adequate to take care of it.
to nije, can you repeat please?
That is not adequate to take care of it.
To nije adekvatno sa davaocem nege,
So they develop a trauma.
tako da razviju traumu.
There's no attachment between the mother and the child.
I nema attachmenta majke i deteta.
There's a break
Postoji praznina, procep.
because the mother is not attached to the child.
Zato što majka nije vezana za dete.
And so the image that it makes of the mother
Tako da slika koju stvara
is also not attached
Da, čuo se. Ne
and
diraj.
not a,
takođe,
Samo stavi ga dobro.
we
Are
have
we
something
okay?
else.
Čuo se.
Yes, but we have some technical problems. Can you
okay.
repeat, please?
Okay. The ego state that develops into the exteropsyche
Ego stanje koje se razvije u eksteropsihi
will also be experienced as being unattached.
takođe će biti doživljeno bez attachmenta.
And the messages that are taken into this ego state are self-destructive, existentially self-destructive.
I poruke koje su unete u ovo ego stanje su destruktivne, samo destruktivne. We have again some technical problems, some voices.
Molim vas da isključite svoje mikrofone, meša nam se, neko je uključio slučajno mikrofon. Please turn your microphones on mute or off, please, because we are hearing someone speaking or something. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So when we look at the ego state diagram of schizophrenics,
Kada pogledamo egogram šizofrene osobe,
this is what we end up dealing with.
sa ovim imamo posla, što sam nacrtala sad.
Instead of having the three ego states all connected to each other,
Umesto da imamo tri ego stanja koje su međusobno povezana,
in this situation, the exteropsyche never gets assimilated
No.
into the rest of the ego states.
u ovoj situaciji eksteropsiha nikada ne bude povezana sa preostala dva ego stanja.
It is always experienced as external.
I uvek se doživljava kao nešto spoljašnje.
And the archaeopsyche, or the child ego state,
A arheopsiha ili ego stanje deteta
is always regressed to a very early age.
je uvek upućeno na jako rani razvojni period.
Now they learn adaptations to compensate this.
I razviju adaptacije kako bi to kompenzovali.
But when they decompensate, when they become psychotic,
Ali kada dekompenzuju, kada postaju psihotični,
then this is the ego states that we see.
ovo je ego stanje koje vidimo u tim situacijama.
And what would normally be the attached external ego state
Ono što je normalno bilo, to je atačovano.
Ono što je normalno bilo, atačovana eksteropsiha,
will be experienced as not being a part of their own personality.
Biće doživljeno kao da nije deo sopstvene ličnosti. Dakle, ovo je eksteropsiha.
But they need to take in these messages. They need to form something.
Ali oni moraju da prihvate ove poruke, moraju da formiraju nešto.
Because they're existentially dependent on the mother.
Zato što egzistencijalno zavise od majke.
Or the primary caretaker.
Ili primarnog staratelja.
So they experience having this external person as part of their own personality.
Tako da doživljavaju kao da je neka spoljašnja osoba zapravo deo njihove ličnosti.
And this is basically the source of the hallucinations and the thinking disorders.
I ovo je zapravo uzrok halucinacija i poremećaja mišljenja.
And their personalities are being babies
I njihova ličnost kad su bili bebe
with a dysfunctional parent.
sa disfunkcionalnim roditeljima.
So the goal of our therapy that we developed
Tako da je cilj terapije koju smo razvili
was to find ways to form an attachment to the client.
jeste da pronađemo načine kako bismo sagradili attachment sa klijentom.
Which was, who were very regressed.
Koji je bio veoma regresivan,
But the problem was that their adaptations were unhealthy or not normal adaptations.
ali problem što su njihove adaptacije nezdrave i nenormalne, neuobičajene.
Oni su zapravo radili sa pacijentima koji su bili jako regredirali, dakle na vrlo rane stadijume iz ego stanja deteta, ono što je rekao, znači na vrlo rane stadijume, ali su i na osnovu toga formirali neke adaptacije na tu situaciju koju su morali da prežive.
So the therapeutic process
Tako da je terapijski proces
involves from the adult ego state of the therapist, then the substitution for the mother therapist.
počinje iz ego stanja odraslog terapeuta.
Our interventions are directed at the needy child.
Intervencije su usmerene na dijete sa potrebama.
They're directed at taking care of the adequate aspects of the person.
I usmerene su na adekvatno zbrinjavanje potreba.
Luka, isključite mikrofon, Luka, molim vas.
And what we do is that we develop a new parent ego state within the attachment relationship to the therapist. Shall I say it again?
Jelena Aleksić, jesi tu? Molim te, uključi se.
Yes, please say it again. My mic wasn't working.
Okay, so we develop with the interventions.
Razvijemo sa našim intervencijama.
We develop a new parent ego state.
Razvijemo novo roditelj ego stanje.
That takes place within an attachment relationship.
Koje zauzima mesto u attachmentu.
And we also take care of the regressive child.
I zbrinjujemo se za regresivno dete.
And this needs to go on over a long period of time.
I ovo mora da traje dugo vremena.
Before it begins to take hold.
Pre nego što se učvrsti.
But this is the basic diagram for reparenting.
Ali ovo je osnovni dijagram za reparenting.
And just a second. What we end up doing is that we expose the baby that's not been taken care of.
I ono što mi radimo jest da prikažemo bebu koja nije zbrinuta.
And we take care of it, but within an attachment relationship.
I brinemo se o njoj u okviru attachmenta.
Responding to the needs that were unmet.
Odgovarajući na potrebe koje nisu zbrinute.
Or responding to the needs that a baby would have.
Ili odgovaramo na poruke na potrebe koje bi beba imala.
Now, for the clients, of course, after they begin to get some of those needs met,
ali za klijente kada počnu da im se zbrinjavaju te potrebe,
they expose the trauma they've collected at other developmental stages.
Oni pokazuju traume koje su imali u razvojnim fazama.
So we might start out with the baby.
Možemo da počnemo sa bebom.
But then we'll go on to a 2-year-old.
ali onda ćemo imati dvogodišnjaka,
3 or 4-year-old,
trogodišnjaka, četvorogodišnjaka,
5 to 8-year-olds,
petogodišnjaka do osmogodišnjaka,
8 to 10-year-olds,
od osmogodišnjaka do desetogodišnjaka,
10 to 12-year-olds,
od desetogodišnjaka do dvanaestogodišnjaka,
the different ages or the different stages of adolescence.
Drugačiji, različiti uzrasti u razvoju adolescencije.
And we deal with this in the therapeutic attachment relationship.
I sa ovim se nosimo kroz terapeutski attachment.
Now, of course, we use the tools of therapy to do this.
Naravno koristimo terapeutske alatke da se nosimo s ovim.
So our countertransference is a tool to build hypothesis.
Tako da je naš kontratransfer alat za formiranje hipoteza,
which we then use to find interventions.
što dalje koristimo da nađemo intervencije.
We take on the transference.
Mi preuznemo transfer.
And one of the things we did was to make parenting contracts.
I ono što radimo jeste da napravimo ugovor sa roditeljem.
An agreement to be the parent of the client.
Sorry, ugovor
Yep.
o roditeljevanju. Parenting agreement. Parenting agreement, did you say, right?
Yeah, or contract, parenting contract.
Yeah. Znači ugovor o roditeljevanju. And
A
please start from that.
Yeah, a formal contract to be the parent of the person.
Formalni ugovor da budemo roditelj toj osobi.
And this is where a lot of confusion has occurred.
I ovde je bilo puno zabuna.
I looked at Wikipedia
Pogledao sam na Wikipediji
and I was horrified that this is their definition of reparenting.
i bio sam užasnut ovom definicijom reparentinga.
In reference to our institute.
Koji su se povezali sa našim institutom.
But what we talk about when we talk about reparenting
Ali o čemu mi pričamo kad pričamo o reparentingu
is what happens with the exterior psyche
jeste šta se desi sa eksteropsihom
or the parent ego state.
ili sa ego stanjem roditelja.
And in the treatment of schizophrenia,
I u tretmanu šizofrenije
what happens is that they transfer the energy from the dysfunctional original parent ego state
ono što se dešava jeste da prebace energiju iz disfunkcionalnog ego stanja roditelja
they were never attached. I lost you, which they were never attached to anyway.
za koje nikad inače nisu ni bili vezani.
And they put energy into the new parent ego state that they have developed out of the attachment and relationship to the therapist.
I stavljaju i prebacuju energiju u novo ego stanje roditelja koji su formirali na osnovu attachmenta sa terapeutom.
So what reparenting is the decathexis, or taking energy out of a dysfunctional parent ego state.
Ono što reparenting jeste dekatekiranje nefunkcionalnog ego stanja roditelja, oduzimanje energije iz tog ego stanja.
And building, constructing a new parent ego state that they are connected to.
I izgradnja novog ego stanja roditelja sa kojim su povezani.
That is caretaking and not destructive.
Koji je zbrinjavajući, negujući, ne destruktivan.
And putting energy into that.
I stavljaju energiju u to ego stanje.
And since the exterior psyche or the parent ego state is not self-generated anyway,
I pošto eksteropsiha ne stvara samu sebe,
they deconnect or decathect the old parent ego state.
oni odvežu, odnosno dekatekiraju staro ego stanje roditelja.
So the term reparenting refers to a structural change in the personality of the client.
Tako da termin reparentinga znači promena u strukturi
Ličnosti
ličnosti klijenta.
It has nothing to do really with the work within regression.
Nema nikakve veze sa terminom regresije.
Supporting the regression was just a tool to make this possible.
Podržavanje regresije je samo bilo sredstvo da bi se ovo ostvarilo.
But the process of working with regression is called parenting.
Ali proces koji se koristi u regresiji se zove parentovanje.
Reparenting means constructing a new parent-ego state.
Reparenting znači izgraditi novo ego stanje roditelja.
And this is something.
Just sorry, moment.
Sure.
Tako da znači imamo roditeljevanje i ponovo roditeljevanje. Znači roditeljevanje bi značilo kada je klijent regrediran, a ponovo roditeljevanje bi značilo izgradnju novog ego stanja roditelja, odnosno eksteropsihe.
And this process can only be done by people who were schizophrenic.
I ovaj proces se može samo sprovesti sa ljudima koji su šizofreni.
It's a result of the construction of the personality that only people who are schizophrenic are able to do.
To je zbog same konstrukcije ličnosti koje imaju šizofreni i zato može samo s njima ovo da se radi.
Now, we can do parenting with any of our clients.
Možemo da radimo roditeljevanje sa bilo kojim našim klijentima.
And we often do when we give them new messages.
I to često radimo kada im dajemo nove poruke.
Or when we work with dysfunctional belief systems.
Ili kad radimo sa disfunkcionalnim sistemom mišljenja.
But these are people who, at the age of 10, accepted their exteropsyche as a part of their personality.
Ali to su ljudi koji su već sa 10 godina eksteropsihu prihvatili kao deo svog ličnosti.
And if you have children, you can actually observe this happen.
I ako imate decu, možete posmatrati ovo kako se dešava.
I mean, I listen to the older child speaking to the younger child.
Kada slušate da kad starije dete priča sa mlađim.
And until the age of around 10.
I do uzrasta od 10 godina.
The older child will usually say, Dad says, take out the garbage.
Dete će obično reći, tata kaže da izneseš đubre.
Mom says, do your homework now.
Mama kaže, sad uradi domaći.
At the age of 10, between 10 and 12.
Ali u uzrastu od 10-12 godina.
This changes.
Ovo se menja.
And the older child will say, take out the garbage.
I starije dete će reći, iznesi đubre.
Or do your homework now.
Ili uradi domaći sad.
And that's because they have taken on this value system as a part of themselves.
Zato što su uzeli ovaj vrednosti sistem kao deo sebe.
So they've incorporated this external attachment system.
Tako da su oni inkorporirali ovaj eksterni attachment system
as a part of themselves.
Kao deo sebe.
Since schizophrenics can't do that because they have no attachment.
A pošto šizofreničari to ne mogu da urade zato što nemaju attachment.
Or they had a broken attachment.
Ili imaju slomljeni attachment.
And this was confirmed and re-traumatized at each stage of development.
Ovo je potvrđeno i ponovljeno u svakoj razvojnoj fazi.
Because of this, they did not have a chance to incorporate this exteropsyche as a part of themselves.
Zbog toga oni nisu imali šansu da inkorporiraju eksteropsihu u svoju ličnost.
And that's why they experience it always as external.
I zato ga uvek ga iskuse kao nešto što je odvojeno od njih, doživljavaju.
And that's the core to why reparenting works with schizophrenics but doesn't work with other people.
I to je suština zašto reparenting radi sa šizofrenima, a ne sa ostalim klijentima.
So I hope I can clear up this confusion with that.
I nadam se da mogu razjasniti ovu zabunu.
And that you can understand how the reparenting process takes place.
I da možete da razumete kako se odvija ovaj proces reparentinga.
Now, what we actually did in the institute to facilitate this.
I ono što smo radili u institutu da bismo ovo facilitirali.
Was to allow people to regress.
Jeste da dozvolimo ljudima da regrediraju.
As Jackie Schiff started out, it was spontaneous.
I kad je Jackie Schiff ovo radila, bilo je spontano.
In the institute, we had settings that we created where people were allowed to do that.
Imali smo settinge gde
Znači, u početku kad je Jackie Schiff počinjala, zapravo su se te regresije dešavale spontano, a posle, kada su radili na institutu, oni su imali setting i načine kako da zapravo podrže ili facilitiraju regresiju.
So we would allow them to regress within a safe setting.
tako da smo im dozvolili da u sigurnom okruženju regrediraju.
And at the end of the period, which may be an hour, hour and a half,
Ili možda nakon sat ili sat i po vremena,
we would have them come out of the regression.
mi smo ih izvodili iz regresije.
You know, which is very similar to working with trauma otherwise.
Što je inače vrlo slično u radu sa traumom.
In the time which they were regressed, we did everything we could to make it an environment that relates to that age.
I u momentima kada su regredirali, učinili smo sve da napravimo tako okruženje da je vrlo slično fazi u kojoj regrediraju.
So we would give them diapers or bottles and we would hold them.
Dali bismo im pelene ili flašice ili bismo ih držali.
Always in the group.
Uvek u grupi.
Mostly with a second therapist there.
Često sa drugim terapeutom da je prisutan.
To help provide protection.
Da pomogne da pruži zaštitu.
Because, you know, it's a very physical form of therapy.
Zato što je vrlo fizički oblik terapije.
And so we had to provide protection for both the client and the therapist.
Tako da smo morali da obezbedimo zaštitu i za klijente i za terapeute.
But they would regress back to the age where they had their original trauma.
Ali bi oni regredirali do uzrast gde su imali originalnu traumu.
And we would raise them again.
I mi bi ih odgojili ponovo.
And we, of course, had different groups also for different ages, but also for different themes.
Imali smo i različite grupe za različite uzraste ili različite teme. Next.
More about that some other time.
Više o tome neki drugi put.
I just want to be clear that there's a difference between parenting and reparenting.
Želim da bude jasno samo da ima razlike između parentinga i reparentinga, odnosno roditeljovanja i ponovnog roditeljovanja.
Reparenting is a structural difference in the personality of the patient.
Reparenting je znači strukturalna razlika kod u ličnosti pacijenta.
And parenting is a process of taking care of the regressive needs of the client.
A parenting je znači vođenje računa, odnosno dakle zadovoljavanje potreba kod klijenta koji je regredirao.
Parenting can be done with any client, and we do it.
Parenting može da se sprovede sa bilo kojim klijentom i mi to i radimo.
And reparenting can only be done with schizophrenics.
A reparenting može da se uradi samo sa schizofrenim pacijentima.
So, I think before I open up another chapter,
dakle, pre nego što otvorimo naredno poglavlje,
I think this is maybe a time to take a break.
Mislim da je vreme da napravimo pauzu.
Yes, 1 minute more.
Imamo još minut.
But we can do it now if you want, and then.
I think we'll do it now. I think it's a good place to stop with it.
Okay, so 5 minutes, everyone.
5 minuta imamo pauzu.
So I have a question for you, Ravi.
Okay.
Imam pitanje za tebe, Ravi.
Do you want to talk some more about the approach, the techniques? Or
No, let's take questions. I think there are probably quite questions.
Yes.
Da li želiš da pričaš i dalje o pristupu, o metodama? Ne, pa mislim da imamo pitanja sada.
And I'm sure I will use that to talk about things.
I to ću koristiti da bih objasnila stvari, odgovorio na pitanje.
So let's go ahead and start with that.
Okay.
Zato ajde da počnemo.
I'm bundling the questions here, and there's a lot of great questions. So maybe we should start with the question about is there
Sakupljala sam pitanja i nekako ih sažimala, pa možda možemo da počnemo od ovoga.
The one question is there any categories of schizophrenics who are they're more qualified for this type of therapy?
Da li postoje neke kategorije schizofrenih koje su više kvalifikovane, podobne za ovu terapiju?
When we work developmentally backwards.
Kada radimo, dakle, razvojno unazad.
So people who are paranoid have a very good prognosis.
Ljudi koji su paranoidni imaju jako dobru prognozu.
People who are paraphrenic have a reasonably good prognosis.
Oni koji su parafreni imaju osrednje, ajde da kažemo, dobru prognozu.
And with hebephrenia, it's the most difficult. The prognosis is not as good.
Kod hebefrenije prognoze nisu tako dobre, tu je najteže.
And this has to do, of course, with also the early neurological development.
Ovo naravno ima veze sa ranim neurološkim razvojem.
As the neurological system develops, there are more skills already present.
I haven't heard this. Sorry, something happened.
As the neurology develops, as the child develops.
Okay, tokom razvoja neurološkog, dakle tokom razvoja deteta,
their neurological capabilities develop also.
Razvojne, dakle, odnosno neurološke sposobnosti se razvijaju, mogućnosti.
You know, we need 3 years to develop neurologically enough to have a sense of being separate.
Trebaju nam, dakle, 3 godine da se razvijemo neurološki u smislu da bi bilo moguće da se odvojimo.
We need this time for the neocortex to develop enough to be able to form thinking systems, logical thinking systems.
Treba nam, dakle, 3 godine da se neokorteks razvije na taj način da možemo da oformimo mišljenje.
So there's an enormous amount of development every day for the baby from one day to the next.
Jako veliki, dakle, razvoj na svakodnevnom nivou je potreban u tom smislu da bi dete moglo da ide dalje.
So when the primary trauma occurs at the separation stage of 9 months.
Kada se, dakle, primarna trauma desi na otprilike u 9. mesecu u razvoju.
There was before that a system that worked. There was an attachment there.
Pre toga je postojao sistem koji je radio, postojao je attachment.
So somebody who develops paranoid schizophrenia.
Tako da neko ko razvije paranoidnu schizofreniju
has some skills for being able to have a healthy attachment.
Ima određene veštine, dakle, mogućnosti da napravi zdrav odnos, povezanost.
And this is an enormous help in being able to treat them.
Ovo je užasno važna pomoć u smislu toga da možemo da ih lečimo.
Now, somebody who's hebephrenic has so much dysfunction both in the attachment as well as in the physical adaptations.
Neko ko je hebefren ima, dakle, problematiku i u smislu attachmenta, a i u fizičkom razvoju.
That it's almost impossible to find some place to hook on.
Tako da je zapravo jako teško naći neko mesto za koje možete da se zakačite.
And we need extremely skilled therapists who know about attachment to be able to reach them there.
I dakle, jako su nam potrebni vrlo vešti terapeuti koji dobro znaju attachment i mogu da se nose sa ovim.
And when they experience the attachment, they move into a huge level of dependency.
Kada osete attachment, ulaze zapravo u jako veliku zavisnost, povezanost.
And it's very difficult to hold it in the therapeutic context.
jako je teško da se to izdrži u terapijskom kontekstu.
And so, the chances of their breaking the attachment are, for just a small thing, are very high.
I zapravo mogućnost da se taj attachment prekine su jako velike.
So the ones who are the most suited for the therapy are the paranoid schizophrenics.
Tako da, odgovor je zapravo da su najbolji za terapiju, najpodesniji paranoidni schizofreničari.
And the younger they are and the fewer psychotic breaks they've had, the easier
Znači, što su mlađi i što su manje imali psihotičnih slomova, lakše je zapravo izlečiti ih.
It's just so much easier if they've not repeated that trauma over and over.
Mnogo je lakše ako nisu ponavljali, dakle, tu traumu ponovo i ponovo.
One of we had in our institute.
Jedan od pacijenata koji smo imali na institutu
was that with very few exceptions, we only took young schizophrenics.
Uzimali smo dakle samo mlade schizofrene pacijente.
But this had one very good reason.
Za to je postojao razlog.
The therapy took 10 to 12 years.
Za terapiju je bilo potrebno 10 do 12 godina.
So if you have somebody with a healthy personality structure and they start therapy at 40 years of age,
ako imate nekog sa zdravom strukturom ličnosti i on počne terapiju sa 40 godina,
and then they're done when they're like 52 or 53,
i ako je završe u 52. i 3.
how are they going to earn a living?
Kako će onda da rade?
How are they going to set up new social structures?
Da naprave novu socijalnu strukturu okruženja.
For a lot of those things, it's too late.
Za mnoge stvari je kasno.
So unless somebody had already done had a way to earn a living,
osim ako neko nije već osmislio, napravio neke načine da zarađuje za život,
we wouldn't take them if they were older.
Ne bismo ih uzimali ukoliko bi bili stariji.
And the other reason was that the fewer psychotic episodes that someone had.
A drugi razlog je bio to zapravo što su manje imali psihotičnih lomova,
the higher the chances of their not having
veće su šanse bile
chronified their psychotic structure.
We lost you.
Can you repeat?
The higher the chances of their not having a chronic psychotic structure.
Znači, što su manje imali psihotičnih slomova, manje je verovatnoća bila da se oformi, dakle, da se učvrsti psihotična struktura.
Now, this seems like some kind of discrimination.
Yes, you have already a comment in chat. Like,
okay, yep.
Is this an ageism?
Yeah. Da, izgleda kao određena vrsta diskriminacije, dakle, na osnovu godina.
And that's one reason why we would take people who were older if they had a way of when they're done, had a way of being able to support themselves.
I to je razlog zašto smo ipak uzimali starije, dakle, pacijente, samo dakle u slučaju koliko su imali već razvijen neki način da zarađuju za svoj život.
But if you don't have a way to release someone at the end of therapy in a way that they can live a healthy life,
ali ako nemate mogućnost da nekoga otpustite iz terapijskog procesa i da on nastavi da živi zdrav život,
then I think we need to look at the ethical possibilities to heal them.
Mislim da treba da razmislimo i pogledamo, dakle, etičke mogućnosti o tome da ih izlečimo.
And I still think that there's ethical questions about healing someone who then are incapable of taking care of themselves.
Mislim i dalje da postoje važna etička pitanja o tome da izlečite nekog i da on nastavi da živi dalje.
So in our choice of clients, it was not that we wouldn't take people who were older.
Dakle, naša odluka da ne uzimamo starije pacijente.
But we wouldn't take people who were older who had no possibility of taking care of themselves at the end of therapy.
Ali one, dakle, koji na kraju terapije, odnosno nakon terapije, ne mogu da se brinu o sebi.
And if they had the ability, then it didn't matter how old they were.
Ako bi imali mogućnosti, onda to zaista nije ni bilo važno.
And of course, we can talk about what's the definition of being healthy.
Naravno, možemo uvijek pričati o tome šta je zapravo definicija toga biti zdrav.
And that usually takes about 3 evenings with long conversations.
To podrazumeva i zahteva jedno tri večeri poduže konverzacije.
My personal definition of that
Moja lična definicija zdravlja
is the possibility to take care of myself physically,
mogućnost da se o sebi brinem u fizičkom smislu,
includes taking care of myself in terms of feeding myself, keeping clean,
u smislu dakle da mogu da se nahranim, da budem čist, da održavam čistoću,
but also the possibility to earn a living and to create a social network.
ali isto tako da budem u mogućnosti dakle da zarađujem za život i da održavam socijalnu mrežu, svoju socijalnu mrežu.
And all that are different aspects of being psychologically healthy for me.
Za mene to su sve aspekti toga da si zapravo zdrav.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there's another few questions about the technique. The people want to know if you can say something about techniques or what have you actually used, what kind of techniques. And another question connected to that is, if the parenting is just one of the methods you have used within the reparenting, can you tell us what other methods you use? Or,
Okay.
Sorry, just a second for the translation.
Yeah.
Dakle, pitanja su vezana za tehnike, koje tehnike je sve koristio u radu i takođe ako je pričao o parentingu kao delu reparentinga, znači šta još kao od jednoj od mogućnosti, šta još je koristio osim toga?
Okay, it is of course only one of the methods we used.
To je zapravo jedan metod koji smo koristili.
But since our focus, and it needs to be to begin with, our focus was on reparenting.
Naš fokus je bio na reparentingu.
I sort of focused there.
Fokusirao sam se tamo.
We used techniques coming out of body therapy.
Koristili smo tehnike iz telesne psihoterapije.
Because sometimes to get to a trauma, it's easier to go over the body than to go through speaking.
Nekada da biste došli do traume, dakle mnogo je lakše ići preko tela nego kroz razgovor.
Especially for early issues.
Naročito za onu najraniju problematiku.
We also used all the other techniques of transaction analysis.
Takođe smo koristili sve ostale tehnike iz transakcione analize.
And one of the techniques that we used and had to use was confrontation.
Jedna od tehnika koju smo koristili, koju smo morali da koristimo, jeste konfrontacija.
The confrontation of pathological behavior.
Konfrontacija patološkog ponašanja.
Now, confrontation has often been used in a way that is a power struggle.
Konfrontacija je dakle često viđena kao borba u smislu moći.
That for me is not ethical confrontation.
Za mene to nije etička konfrontacija.
Confrontation needs to take care of the client.
U konfrontaciji moramo da se pobrinemo za klijenta.
So what we would confront would be pathological behavior.
Dakle, konfrontirali bismo patološko ponašanje na taj način.
For instance, the 4 forms of pathology, of passivity.
Na primer, 4 tipa pasivnosti.
And there's a very special or very definite form of confrontation.
I postoji vrlo specijalna, vrlo naročita forma konfrontacije.
The first one is the confrontation, the wording needs to be absolutely clear.
Prva stvar je dakle da kod konfrontacije reči, odnosno izrazi i terminologija koja se upotrebljava mora da bude prilično jasna.
And it needs to include my experience of the pathological behavior.
I mora da uključi moje razumevanje i iskustvo patološkog ponašanja.
For instance, I wouldn't confront somebody by saying, I don't like how you behaved with me yesterday.
Na primer, ne bih konfrontirao na način, ne sviđa mi se kako si se juče ponašao prema meni.
Because that sends them in a whole tangent of thinking about what was it that Ravi is talking about.
Postavilo bi se pitanje zapravo šta Ravi uopšte govori, na šta misli.
But I might say to somebody who's paranoid, I want you to stop provoking me.
Ali mogu da kažem nekome ko je paranoidan, želim da prestaneš da me provociraš.
And I need to come from a position, a personal position, that the other person is capable of doing this.
I polazim, dakle, moram da pođem iz te pozicije da je druga osoba sposobna da to uradi.
I can't confront on somebody if they don't have a possibility to respond to that.
Ne mogu da konfrontiram nekoga ako oni zapravo nemaju sposobnost da na to odgovore na pravi način.
And I say the wording of the confrontation needs to be clear enough that I say you can stick it in your pocket.
Dakle, reči moraju da budu prilično jasne.
So the first thing is to define the behavior that's destructive.
Prvo, dakle, moramo da definišemo ponašanje koje je destruktivno.
The second thing is to be clear about my expectations about what needs to be different.
Drugo, dakle, moraju da budu jasna očekivanja, moja očekivanja o tome šta to treba da bude tačno drugačije.
The third is to give the other person the opportunity to work on it.
Treće, dati drugoj osobi mogućnost da radi, da ima mogućnost dakle, da radi na tome.
And the fourth one is to keep engaged until both of us are okay.
I dakle, poslednja stvar jeste da budemo jedno i drugo angažovani dok ne postignemo ok pozicije, u smislu da jedno i drugo budemo ok.
And using this formula keeps from it being used as a abuse of power.
Korišćenje ove formule zapravo dovodi do toga da nas sprečava da uđemo u ono korišćenje u negativnom smislu korišćenja zloupotrebe moći.
Something else that we used
Koristili smo još nešto.
was diagnostic groups.
Diagnostic
groups.
Diagnostic groups. Koristili smo dakle dijagnostičke grupe.
Peer groups of the different people according to diagnosis.
Peer grupe u zavisnosti od toga dakle kakva je bila dijagnoza.
So they have a chance to talk about common symptoms.
Tako da su imali šanse, dakle mogućnosti da razgovaraju o svojim zajedničkim najčešćim simptomima.
We in fact learned a lot about the construction of the psyche of someone who's schizophrenic from our patients.
Zapravo smo mnogo naučili od svojih pacijenata o samoj konstrukciji strukturi psihe.
Out of discussions that they had with each other.
Iz tih diskusija koje su imali jedni sa drugima.
And with us.
I sa nama.
We had a lot of just practical training.
Imali smo dosta praktičnih treninga.
Because, people who've been schizophrenic generally need to learn to cook and to clean and to wash and things like that.
Jer ljudi koji su schizofreni zapravo moraju da uče da kuvaju, da čiste, takve stvari.
According to their cognitive possibilities.
Naravno u skladu sa njihovim kognitivnim mogućnostima.
So these are all examples of other things that we focused on.
Eto, to su još neke druge stvari na koje smo bili fokusirani.
And different forms of interventions that we would use in dealing with the pathology.
I različite forme intervencija koje smo koristili da bismo rešavali, dakle, patologiju.
So it was not just parenting, it was also all of these different aspects.
Dakle, nije bio samo parenting, nego svi ovi različiti aspekti.
And since schizophrenics can have very violent feelings.
S obzirom na to da schizofreni mogu da imaju vrlo nasilna osjećanja.
We developed ways that they could explore those shadow areas of their behavior and feelings.
Dakle, napravili smo tako da mogu da otkriju, da istraže te svoje mračne strane svojih osjećanja.
That they could, for instance, release early rage, oral rage.
Da bi mogli zapravo da oslobode svoj taj najraniji gnev, bes, da bi mogli da ga oslobode.
Iz oralne faze razvoja.
By finding ways to physically hold them so they could use their whole body to express that rage.
Da bismo zapravo našli način da ih fizički pridržimo da bi mogli da iskale svoj bes.
Without anybody ever being physically hurt.
Naravno da niko ne bi zapravo bio fizički povređen.
I think it's very interesting that we found ways with the patients themselves. They developed this with us.
Zanimljivo je zapravo da smo zajedno sa pacijentima našli te načine.
To find ways to be able to deal with these feelings over which they felt they had no control.
Nađu načine zapravo da se nosi sa ovim osjećanjima nad kojima su mislili da nemaju nikakvu kontrolu.
And we would do that in the large groups.
I to bismo radili u velikim grupama.
Okay, is that enough answer to that?
Ok, da li je ovo dovoljan odgovor na ovo pitanje?
Yes, absolutely, because we have a lot more questions.
Okay.
Da, zato što imamo još mnogo pitanja. Next, please.
So, okay, so another group of questions is about comparing reparenting therapy with medication therapy. So, if it is more efficient, reparenting comparing to medication, how much is efficient? And is it possible to achieve the structural change without the medication? Are there any positive did you measure the positive effects and possible negative effects of reparenting? And also our favorite question about what do you think about genetics as a cause, or how much is genetics is involved in a cause of schizophrenia? Prevešću ja, pošto sam svašta nešto pitala. Tako da, pitanje se odnosi koliko je efikasniji reparenting u odnosu na terapiju lekovima, da li je moguće da se postigne strukturalna promjena bez lekova, kako su merili kvantitativno i kvalitativno pozitivne efekte reparentinga i moguće negativne posljedice, kao i kolika je uloga genetike u uzrocima schizofrenije. So I just translated into Serbian because it's in Serbian actually.
So yes, yes, no, yes, no. No. One thing is that we were a research institute.
Jedna od stvari je da bili smo istraživački institut.
So our no medication policy had also to do with the fact that we were researching treating schizophrenia without medication.
I sama činjenica da smo lečili šizofreniju bez lekova je odgovarala našem istraživačkom cilju da to radimo.
If I were to do it now, I would use medication in acute situations.
Kada bih sad imao mogućnost da ponovim to iskustvo, u nekim akutnim situacijama koristio bih lekove.
Just because I think it can be of great use.
Zato što mislim da mogu koristiti.
And of course, the kind of medication now is different than it was back in 1985.
Naravno, lekovi sada su znatno drugačiji nego što su bili 1995. godine.
Most of the people who came to us were getting
85.
Most of the people who came to us were on very heavy medication that made changes to how they were aware of the world.
Mnogi koji su dolazili kod nas prethodno su bili na izuzetno jakim lekovima koji su uticali na njihov pogled na svet.
And today the antipsychotic medications is very different.
A sa antipsihotičnim lekovima to je sada dosta drugačije.
So yes, I would use medication in certain periods of the therapy now.
Tako da, sada u nekim etapama terapije bih koristio lekove.
I wouldn't use just medication.
Ali ne bih koristio samo lekove.
And I would take people off medication when they get more into the compensated phases of their treatment.
I isključivao bi lekove kako bi pacijenti dolazili u neke bolje faze tretmana.
In terms of the effectiveness of our therapy versus just medication?
Ako govorimo o efikasnosti ove terapije u odnosu samo na lekove.
I talked to a professor, I gave a lecture at the university in Frankfurt.
Imao sam predavanje na univerzitetu u Frankfurtu.
For the psychiatric department last week.
Za odeljenje psihijatrije baš prošle nedelje.
And I asked the psychiatrist what the recovery rate with schizophrenia is.
I pitao sam psihijatre koji je procenat oporavka kod šizofrenije.
And he said the first thing is schizophrenia is not healable.
I rekli su mi prvo da ona nije izlečiva.
And the second thing is that they have, at the moment, an 18% of what they call a spontaneous healing.
I kao drugo da oni u ovom trenutku imaju oko 18% onog što bi nazvali spontanim izlečenjem.
Now, in independent studies made of our patients,
U nezavisnim studijama koje smo mi radili sa našim pacijentima,
both at the end of therapy and after left our institute 5 and 10 years before,
u toku terapije i pošto bi od 5 do 10 godina napustili naš institut,
conducted by the Carnegie Mellon University. Carnegie Mellon University.
sad ne znam da li
Od strane instituta Carnegie Mellon, to istraživanje je sprovedeno.
By Professor Jay Cadane. And this is, I researched this, you can find it on the internet.
To istraživanje postoji na internetu. Možete ga pronaći, profesora.
Can you repeat the name of the professor, please?
And they've, Jay Cadane, Kadane. Now, the interesting thing is that
we lost you again. We didn't hear. I'm sorry.
Okay,
But you can write in the chat.
And somebody called, let's try this again. And a colleague called, I need to send to everybody. I realized I said it to someone.
To everybody. To everybody.
Yeah.
Treba da pošaljem svima, ne samo Sandri.
Now, these were researchers who were not on our staff.
Ovo su istraživači koji nisu bili članovi našeg osoblja.
Julie Erb was a biochemist.
J.R. je bio biohemičar.
Jay Cadane was a mathematician.
J. Cadane je bio matematičar.
And they researched our patients.
I oni su vršili istraživanje sa našim pacijentima.
And they found that over 84% when they were finished with therapy,
I našli su da 84% njih kada završe sa terapijom
had no signs of schizophrenia,
nema nikakvih znaka schizofrenije,
even if they left years before.
iako su otišli više godina unazad.
Now, these are old studies.
Ali ovo su stare studije.
And maybe if we studied again using other factors, we would find something different. I can't say.
I možda sada ako bi radili neko drugo istraživanje, uključujući neke druge faktore, ne bi dobili iste rezultate. To ne mogu da kažem.
Okay, there is one question connected to this, so I interrupt you. And it says, after the successful treatment, can you consider the client a healthy personality, or are there any lingering disorders that are common? Dakle, da li posle uspešnog tretmana smatrate da je klijent ima zdravu ličnost ili postoje neke zaostali poremećaji koji su uobičajeni?
There's a healthy level of neurosis that remains.
Uvek ostaje zdravi nivo neuroze.
And we sent our patients, all of them, we send them to therapists who are not connected with us when they were done with us.
I kad završe sa nama, mi smo sve naše pacijente slali kod terapeuta koji nisu
they all got
povezani
therapy
sa nama.
to deal with, the problems that result in the relationship to us.
Kako bi mogli da rade na problemima koji su povezani sa nama.
And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that Froman and Gottlieb,
Još jedna stvar koju sam želeo da pomenem su da
Froman and Gottlieb, I'll write their names out again.
Gamsli.
Mislim
nisam
su
sigurna.
Froman i Gottlieb, recimo. Ali ne
Forman
piše
i
u
Gottlieb.
četu.
Ja ne znam da li je do mog neta ili se on stvarno prekida.
These were the major researches in the uptake of tryptophan and serotonin levels in schizophrenia.
Ova dva istraživača su mjerila nivo serotonina kod
I
šizofrenije.
triptofana kod schizofreničara i verovatno u to doba nivo triptofana ili nešto što se izlučuje mokraćom ili njihovih, da kažem, raspadnih produkata.
And they used our patients as a control group because they got no medication.
I koristili su naše pacijente kao kontrolnu grupu zato što oni nisu koristili lekove.
And what they found was that for 100% of our patients, after 3 years, they had normal values in tryptophan uptake and serotonin.
I pronašli su da čak i posle 3 godine naši pacijenti imaju novi nivo serotonina i
Imaju normalan nivo uptake-a, dakle preuzimanja serotonina i triptofana, znači čak i 3 godine posle terapije.
Now, they were not well yet,
Naravno, oni nisu bili dobro još,
but biochemically, they were
ali
healthy.
biohemijski,
And these are all independent studies. They didn't have to do with us. We weren't researching this.
ali biohemijski bili su zdravi i naravno sve su ovo nezavisne studije koji nisu imali direktne veze sa nama.
We used psychological testing to determine if someone was healthy at the end of therapy.
Mi smo koristili psihološke testove da bismo ustanovili da li je neko zdrav posle terapije.
But these independent studies I find very interesting.
Ali ove nezavisne studije smatram da su jako zanimljive.
And I wouldn't say that it's possible to heal schizophrenia in every case.
I ja ne mislim da je moguće izlečiti schizofreniju u svakom slučaju.
With therapy.
Terapijom.
But we did have some success.
Ali imali smo nekog uspeha.
And of course, there are a lot of factors depending on who you take on and all of the rest of it.
Naravno, postoji mnogo faktora koje dolazi o koga smo...
You know, how heterogeneous is the group that you're working with to begin with and all kinds of things.
Kakva je epigeneza grupe sa kojom radimo i još mnogi faktori.
That obviously affect the chances or the success.
Koji naravno utiču na šansu za uspeh.
But it is possible to work with us.
Ali je moguće raditi da.
Okay, so can you please refer to was there any negative effects to this therapy, and what do you think about genetics as a possible part of the cause or the cause of schizophrenia?
Okay, there are negative effects of this kind of therapy. A lot for the therapist.
Ima dosta negativnih utjecaja na terapeut.
I mean, it's an incredibly intensive personal form of therapy.
To je neverovatno intenzivan oblik ličnog rada, lične terapije.
And for the patients, I think, you know, one reason that we send them to therapy after they left us was that they needed to deal with the attachment relationships to us.
A što se tiče pacijenata, jedan od razloga zašto smo ih slali na terapiju posle boravka u institutu jeste što treba da razreše pitanje attachmenta sa nama.
Because a lot of what we did was involved in a pathological attachment.
Mnoge stvari koje smo radili su zapravo zasnovane na nekom obliku patološkog attachmenta.
Which we over time, of course, changed.
Koji smo tokom vremena promenili.
But what with is a pathological attachment.
We lost you.
That's why I think it's really important.
We lost you again.
What do you start out with? Hello? Do you hear me?
The last thing we heard it was that you changed later some of the pathological attachment, and that was all. Then it.
Okay, we start out with pathological attachment, and we attempt to heal it into healthy attachment.
Počeli smo od patološkog attachmenta i nastojali smo da ga pretvorimo u zdrav attachment.
But of course, there is some re-traumatization that takes place when dealing with the unhealthy attachment.
Ali naravno postoje neke retraumatizacije koje nastaju zbog rada sa tim attachmentom.
And that's one reason why I find it really important, even after this kind of therapy, that people go to independent therapists to deal on the relationship to us as therapists.
I zato sam smatrala da je jako važno kada oni završe terapiju kod nas, odu na terapiju izvan centra kako bi riješile te attachment pitanja vezana za nas na institutu.
And I would never be so grandiose as to say that I'm, the perfect parent or the perfect therapist.
I naravno ne bih mogao da kažem da postoji savršen terapeut i savršen pacijent.
But in the intensity of the therapy that we're talking about, that has more consequences than in the practice that I'm in here now.
I'm not sure that I
In the kind of
kažem da zapravo ova vrsta terapije ima mnogo drugačije konsekvence na terapeuta, mnogo intenzivnije nego kad radimo, da kažemo, u običajnom tipu psihoterapijske prakse. And connected to that, there was a question about
how do you cope with it?
How did you feel during working with patients with schizophrenia, or how was what was the most often counter-transference feelings? So that's probably connected to what you just were talking.
Okay, the counter-transference depends on the diagnosis. I couldn't say for all of them it was the same.
Kontratransfer zavisi od dijagnoze. Sorry, ne bih mogla da kažem za sve da su isti.
I was in intensive psychotherapy for myself as well as supervision 3 times a week when I worked with schizophrenics.
Ali ja sam bio i na intenzivnoj psihoterapiji sopstveno i na intenzivnim supervizijama dok sam radio tamo čak do 3 puta nedeljno.
I think we just have to have that when working with this population this way.
Ja mislim da je to neophodno kada radimo sa ovakvom populacijom.
For the protection of the patients.
Zbog zaštite pacijenta.
And the sanity of the therapist.
I ludila terapeuta.
Mentalnog zdravlja terapeuta.
Mentalnog zdravlja terapeuta.
Okay, now I want to say something about genetics because this always comes.
Želim da kažem nešto i o genetici, jer je to uvek aktuelno.
And I had this in the psychiatric hospital also, obviously, in the medical unit.
I imao sam to pitanje isto na psihijatriji.
Now, I think genetics do play a role.
Mislim da genetika igra određenu ulogu.
I don't, from my experience, say that they're the sole source of schizophrenia.
Ali po mom iskustvu ne mogu da kažem to važi za sve oblike šizofrenije.
And this absolutely wonderful professor that I met at the university.
Jedan izuzetan profesor koga sam upoznala na univerzitetu.
I had a wonderful encounter with him.
Imao sam izuzetan susret sa njim.
Because one of the young psychiatrists got up and said, but we know that schizophrenia is genetic.
Jedan mladi psihijatar je ustao i rekao, ali mi znamo da je schizofrenija nasledna.
So why do I talk about these social aspects?
I zašto govorimo o socijalnim aspektima?
And I said, how do you decide that it's genetic?
A ja sam ga pitao kako znaš da je genetska.
Because as far as I know, there is still in the research with the human genome, they've not found a genetic code for schizophrenia.
Jer koliko ja znam, istraživanja koje se bave ljudskim genomom još uvijek nisu našla potvrdu da je genetska.
No, I might be wrong about it because I'm not working with schizophrenics. I don't do all that research anymore.
Možda grešim zato što ja ne radim više sa šizofrenim pacijentima i nisam ispratio najnovija istraživanja.
But the professor agreed with me.
Ali profesor se složio sa mnom.
So I asked this young psychiatrist, why does he say that it's genetically caused?
Tako da sam pitao ovog mladog psihijatra zašto misli da je genetski uslovljeno.
And he said, when you look at the families of schizophrenics, you always find somebody in the generations before who was also schizophrenic.
On je rekao, kada pogledamo genetsku stavu pacijenata, uvijek ćemo naći nekog u prethodnim generacijama koji su imali schizofreniju.
So I looked at him with some surprise.
Ja sam ga pogledao iznenađeno.
And I said, I come from a wine growing region here in Germany.
I rekao sam, ja dolazim iz vinskog područja u Njemačkoj.
And that, if you look at the families of the vintners, there was always somebody in the generation before who was a vintner.
I ako pogledate porodice vinogradara, uvijek ćete naći nekog ko se prethodno bavio vinogradarstvom.
does that mean being a vintner is genetically predetermined?
Da li to znači da je bavljenje vinogradarstvom genetski predodređeno?
And he sat down and the professor looked at me
On je seo, a profesor me pogledao.
and said, you know, we're looking for the schizococcus, but we can't find it.
Zato što mi tražimo i schizococcus, ali ne možemo da ga pronaći.
So this is how I think about genetics. Now, I'm not so naive as to say genetics don't play a role.
To ja mislim o genetici. Naravno, nisam toliko naivan da kažem da je genetika uopšte ne igra nikakvu ulogu.
Of course, the individual DNA is constantly being changed
Naravno, individualni DNK se stalno menja
due to environmental factors and, you know, our
pod
what
uticajem različitih.
and I think that if there are particular feelings or needs that are suppressed over generations,
Se menja pod uticajem različitih faktora, različite potrebe društvene koje su
Osjećanja koja su u generacijama bila potisnuta.
of course, it will have an effect on the genetics of the person at the end of that chain.
Naravno da će imati uticaja na genetiku osobe na kraju tog lanca.
So I think there is a predisposition that is also genetic.
Tako da mislim da postoji predispozicija koja je također genetska.
And we need to deal with that when working with therapeutically also.
I treba da to imamo u vidu kada radimo terapeutski također.
But I
Okay,
don't
Ravi,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we're going to, I'm thinking about time and it's about time to finish. So I will add one more question. We have more, but I think this may be important to refer to this one. And it's about what do you think about contemporary use? So how does a contemporary approach to working with psychosis look like in terms of TA? In your opinion, what is the efficiency of contemporary approach in comparison to Schiff's model? Or is anybody working reparenting with schizophrenic today? If not, why not? So it's about, are we using it still? Do you know using it? If not, why? And things like that.
As far as I know, nobody's doing it anymore.
Do you know
And,
why?
Various reasons. One of them is money. We had to close down because we were sued by pharmaceutical companies. And
Translation, please. Translation, please. We don't have translation.
Okay.
Hoćeš da ja nastavim, Marijana, ili neko drugi?
Može,
Evo mogu ja da malo odmorite. Niko to ne radi trenutno, koliko ja znam, zbog farmaceutskih kompanija.
iz raznih razloga, ali jedan od
Iz raznih razloga.
pare, i mi smo bili tuženi od strane farmaceutskih kompanija.
And we got paid by the state of California $65 a month.
I bili smo kažnjeni od države Kalifornije $65 mesečno.
Did you were paid or
bail?
The kazna?
The state paid $65 a month for therapy.
Aha, država Kalifornije je plaćala $65 mesečno za terapiju.
Now, that doesn't at all pay for what we were doing.
To ni blizu ne pokriva ono što smo mi radili.
And that's the case generally.
To je generalno takav slučaj.
I had a psychologist who wanted to work this way.
Imao sam psihologe koji su hteli da rade u takvim uslovima.
And he presented the health insurance people with how much money would be saved if they used this.
I oni su prezentovali osiguranju koliko bi mogli da uštede ako bi koristili naše usluge.
And they weren't interested.
Ali oni nisu bili zainteresovani.
So, you know, we do need to earn a living, and I understand this.
I moramo da zaradimo za život i to razumem.
The other thing is that I think it's very difficult to have a healthy private family and to be involved with pathology at this level.
A druga stvar, mislim da je teško da se bavimo patologijom na ovom nivou, a da imamo zdravu porodicu.
So you need dedicated therapists who are willing to make some sacrifices in terms of their private life.
Dakle, trebaju nam posvećeni terapeuti koji su spremni da žrtvuju neke stvari iz privatnog života.
And I understand when people aren't willing to do that.
I razumem kada ljudi ne žele to da rade.
So I think modifications and certain techniques can be taken over in institutions now.
I mislim da sada u institutu moguće da se naprave neke modifikacije vezano za tretman.
But the complete program, the way we did it, it's just not feasible today.
Ali kompletan program koji smo mi tada koristili trenutno sada nije isplativ.
Now, there were other projects in different countries that use these methods and variations.
Postoji u drugim zemljama da se koriste ovakvi metodi sa nekim razlikama.
It was Martin Calvinhoven in the Netherlands.
Sorry, where? In Netherlands?
Holland, yeah, Netherlands, yeah.
U Holandiji.
What was the name of the professional?
Calvinhoven.
Calvinhoven.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was a wonderful woman called Jenny in England who had a project.
Postala žena Jenny iz Engleske koja je imala projekat.
We had another institute in India which was much bigger than the one in the States.
Kao i jedan veliki institut u Indiji koji je veći od ovog u Americi.
There were different projects in the US that worked this way.
Postojali su i različiti projekti u Americi koji su radili na sličan način.
But as far as I know, none of them are doing it anymore.
Ali po mom saznanju nijedan više ne radi ovako.
Okay.
So actually you told us that some techniques and knowledge and approach which were learned in the past century with working with schizophrenia can be applied today in institution or in private settings, but not the way you were doing it. Am I right?
U suštini rekli ste nam da ove metode, tehnike i pristup koji ste vi koristili u prošlom veku i dalje mogu da se koriste, ali ne na ovaj način.
Yeah, I worked with a psychiatric hospital with 1,000 beds.
Radio sam sa psihijatrijom koja ima 1000 kreveta, 1000 mesta.
Here in Germany.
Ovde u Nemačkoj.
And they brought down the medication they were giving out to 1/3 of what it was within 2 years.
Oni su u roku od 2 godine smanjili količinu lekova koji su davali u terapiji na 1/3.
And they got a phone call from the Ministry of Health.
I dobili su poziv od Ministarstva zdravlja.
They were told to stop doing it.
I zatraženo je da prestanu to da rade.
Because crazy people don't vote anyway.
Jer ludaci onako ne glasaju.
This was the actual wording that this person used.
To je upravo termin koji je ta osoba iskoristila.
And it has to do with jobs in the pharma industry.
I naravno povezano je sa poslovima, odnosno radnim mestima u industriji, u farmaciji.
So after 3 years I stopped working with them.
I posle 3 godine prestao sam da radim za njih.
Because they were told to stop working that way.
Jer im je rečeno da ne rade više na taj način.
No, I'm not paranoid and I don't think the pharma industry is all cruel and the rest of it.
Nisam paranoičan i ne mislim da je farmacija okrutna.
But I think it's a very complex system.
Ali mislim da je to veoma kompleksan sistem.
So I think that's it, Sandra.
Dakle, mislim da je to, Sandra.
Yeah, I think we should stop now because it's more than 2 hours now. So.
Staćemo sada jer je prošlo 2 sata.
And I want to thank you in front of my organization and the Association of all Psychotherapy Associations in Serbia, which was co-organizing this workshop.
Želim da ti se zahvalim u svoje ime i u ime svih saveza koji su sarađivali u organizaciji ove radionice.
And to invite the people to come to our conference, which starts in the on Thursday, and in that conference they can again listen to you because you have a plenary session on Friday morning.
I pozivam ljude da dođu na kongres koji će se održati u četvrtak i da kažem da vi i Ravi imate planirano predavanje u četvrtak prepodne.
Yes, and it was planetary also today. It's okay.
Planetarno, da.
Petak.
Oh,
petak
sorry,
je, izvinjam se.
it's Friday. Yeah, the conference starts on Thursday, but the plenary is on Friday morning. And I think the title of this plenary is, do you remember what is the title of the plenary, Ravi?
I know what the topic is.
Okay, can you say it, please?
Yeah, the topic is the causes for an increase in personality disorders.
Oh yeah,
in the present time.
Da, dakle, povećanje broja, odnosno postotka poremećaja ličnosti u savremenom svetu. Savremeni svet se odnosi na svet posle 2 velika svetska rata. To je vrlo aktuelna tema jer zapravo znamo da se zaista dramatično povećava, da kažem, učešće broja ili procenta poremećaja ličnosti u odnosu na recimo pre 50 godina. I onda će Ravi pričati o tome u petak prepodne na kongresu. Okay, Ravi, do you have something to say to us?
5 days away. That's 5 days away.
Yes, 5 days away.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you all very much, especially my translators.
Yes, translators were great, superb. Thank you, translators.
Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you, Sandra, for organizing all of this.
And thank you for agreeing for this. And thank you for all of you who were patiently listening to us. And we apologize for not answering to all the questions. But as I say, we are going to organize a whole day workshop so Ravi can teach you much more about reparenting approach, techniques, and you are going to be able to ask much more questions there. And we will inform you on time on that.
Yeah, if anybody needs to get a hold of me, please do it through Sandra.
Da, i ako neko hoće da stupi u kontakt sa Ravijem, može preko mene.
You're welcome to publicize my email address. That's okay, Sandra.
Aha, okay.
And yeah, have a good night. I'm going to go eat pizza.
Nice. Bon appetit.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you immensely.
Please fill in the survey form. It's really short, but please do fill it. It's just like 5 questions and you need like 3 minutes for that. So Ravi, see you on Friday, and thank you very much again for this.
You're welcome.
Thank you, translators, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Tschüss.
Bye. Bye. Bye.